Thank you so much, everyone, for being here today. We're super excited to have you. My name is Margaret Stern, and I'm the Program and Communications Director for the Susitna River Coalition up in Talkeetna. And welcome to our February Winter Speaker Series event. Before we begin, I want to thank our very generous sponsors that make our entire Winter Speaker Series event possible. And those include the Jessica Stevens Community Foundation and the Matsu Health Foundation. Like I said earlier, this event is being recorded and uploaded onto YouTube, and I'm having a little bit of trouble with the chat, so please utilize the question and answer section right now, and I will work on that as we move forward with the talk. Um, for those of you that don't know the Susitna River Coalition, we work on everything from monitoring large-scale hydro projects like the Susitna Hydro Project to advocating for responsible land management and energy and monitoring and learning about energy issues all across the Susitna watershed. As industries across Alaska kind of grapple with some carbon initiatives, there's been a lot of discussion about the pros and cons of implementing carbon sequestration projects. In the Susitna Valley right now, CCS, or coal and carbon sequestration, is being proposed for both clean coal development, which is raising critical questions about the effectiveness, risks, and long-term impacts to the Matsu region. One of the key aspects being promoted, again, is this carbon capture and sequestration as a way to offset potential emissions. But we've kind of been asking these questions about how realistic is this? What does the data say about its effectiveness? And what are the risks that come with relying on this as a climate solution? So that's why we at the Susitna River Coalition are paying close attention to the proposed coal mining and carbon capture projects proposed in the West Susitna Drainage. We've heard a lot about why CCS could be useful, but we want to present the balanced facts about what CCS is and what the issues are. And so, because of that, we've invited Erin McKittrick to help unpack all of these questions, and we're really fortunate to have her here with us tonight. Erin is a data analyst, a writer, and a wilderness adventurer from Seldovia, Alaska. She has spent years researching and writing about environmental issues, including mining and energy and development, and has some really fantastic long papers on this on a lot of different topics. Erin brings a deep understanding of both science and the broader implications of projects like this, and I'm super excited to have her here to share her insights. So I'm going to pass over the screen to Erin, and please ask whatever questions you might have in the chat. Again, I'll try, or in the question and answer, and I'm going to try and get that chat going. And thank you so much, Erin, for being here.
Thanks for having me. I'm going to share my screen here, and while I'm talking, won't be able to see the chat, but Margaret hopefully will be able to at some point when she gets it to work and can pass on the questions. And I'll also be available to answer questions at the end. So, is my slideshow visible now?
Yes.
Great. So, carbon capture and sequestration, you pretty much got the intro for Margaret already. Why would we be talking about this in the context of the Susitna River? And the reason is because there has been a proposal to put a coal mine, power plant, and carbon sequestration project in the West Susitna area, kind of underneath the word carbon on this screen, near the Squetna River. And so here's the, now if I can get rid of that, anyway. Here's a figure from one of the papers that kind of shows what this project could be. So you can see there's that green hashed area in the upper left. And so that is a coal lease owned by Flatlands Energy. And they've drawn a circle down there at one end of it where they propose to build a power plant, and the rest, would be used for the mine, or some of it. And that would be connected to the rest of the state by the proposed West Susitna Access Road, that blue dashed line. And if they capture carbon, and in order to sequester it, they would build a pipeline going down that pipeline corridor, which it's not an existing pipeline, it's a corridor that Donlin has permits to put a natural gas line in. And then to some of the depleted gas fields there on the shore of Cook Inlet. What's not drawn here is a transmission line, which would obviously also be required. But for the most part, I'm not going to talk about this project specifically. I'm going to, wow, why is this? Okay. For some reason my slides are not advancing. There we go. Anyway, hopefully this works. I'm going to talk about carbon capture, utilization, and storage more generally. So first off, CCS, CCUS, those are the acronyms you commonly hear. The U is pretty important there because for the most part, what exists today, the carbon is being used for oil recovery mostly, more than it is being stored. And so first I'm going to talk about what CCUS exists today, then a little bit about how it works, some of the history of carbon capture and what the technology has been used for, the start of carbon capture tax credits, which in the proposal of this is a climate solution, and then the story of the only two carbon capture using power plants that we know about, Petronova and Boundary Dam. And finally, I'm going to talk about the fundamental issues with this as a solution for the power industry and finish up with a little bit more about the specific proposal. So first off, what carbon capture exists? So as of 2024, there were 47 total facilities in the world capturing carbon. And if you look at this graph, there's several different industries here. And I've highlighted natural gas, LNG, in blue because that's the vast majority of them. It's natural gas processing. And then here in orange are 4 total power plants. And so there's those 2 I mentioned earlier that'll come up again later. And there's also 2 that are more recent in China that we have no information about. And so another way you can look at the exact same set of carbon capture facilities is based on how much carbon dioxide they can potentially capture. So if they're working at full capacity, how much can they suck out of the air? So now you can see natural gas processing hugely dominates. And if you look up at the power plants, that's 2.9 million metric tons per year. And to give you a sense of scale, so the rail belt power grid in general is producing somewhere between 2 and 3 million metric tons per year. So on a global scale, it's pretty minuscule. Now, as I mentioned earlier in that U piece of utilization versus storage, most of these facilities are taking that carbon that they capture and using it for enhanced oil recovery. So that's all the grayed out ones. And there's just a few that are actually trying to store the carbon dioxide permanently underground without using it for something else first. And this is, again, looking at that same set of facilities, but based on capacity this time. And so a couple things you can see here is, okay, this is small, but you'd expect any nascent industry just getting going to be small and ramping up quickly. This is just this new thing we've figured out how to do. But actually, a big part of the technology involved here is something we've had for a very long time. And so this whole natural gas piece is a big part of the history of carbon capture. And that's what I'm going to go to next here. So the carbon separation was a technology that was born for the oil and gas industry. And the technique was patented to take CO2 and remove it from natural gas in 1930. So this isn't people thinking about natural gas. So natural gas is methane, and it comes from reservoirs in the ground. And those reservoirs often contain other things that are not methane. And one of the things they sometimes contain is carbon dioxide. And this is a problem. You don't want carbon dioxide mixed in with your natural gas for a couple of reasons. One, carbon dioxide doesn't burn. So you have too much of it, your natural gas isn't going to be very useful for its intended purpose. And two, carbon dioxide is corrosive. It can react with water to make acid, and it can tend to corrode your pipelines. So pipelines have standards for how much CO2 is allowed in them. So natural gas has been separating the carbon dioxide from the gas they want for a long time. And so basically, how it works is that you run the mixture of gas that has CO2 and other gas through a chemical, usually some kind of amine that binds to the carbon dioxide. Then you use the resulting natural gas that comes out, so usually needs to have 3% or less carbon dioxide in it to go into the natural gas infrastructure. And then you heat the bound amine compound up to release the carbon dioxide it was bound to and regenerate the initial chemical. So you can do this again. And then you vent the carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. So this is what we started with, and this is pretty much what's still done today. So not all natural gas has carbon dioxide in it at enough concentration that it needs to be separated, but a lot does. And there's way more than those 16 facilities I showed you that do this, thousands and thousands of them all over the world. And most just still vent that carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. And so when you really get into carbon capture, is a few decades later, with the invention of another technology of enhanced oil recovery. So the oil industry figured out you can take carbon dioxide and you can inject it into an oil field to increase the pressure in that oil field. And then that increased pressure pushes more oil out. You can separate the carbon dioxide from the oil and repeat the process. And so now you can kind of put these two things together. So the Chute Creek Gas Treatment Facility was built in 1986. It's not the very first carbon capture facility, but it was maybe the second, and it's still one of the largest ones with a capacity of 7 million metric tons per year. And so this solved a big problem with this particular gas field in Wyoming, which is that, it's not uncommon for natural gas to have carbon dioxide mixed in up to, say, 30%. But this particular gas field was really mostly carbon dioxide. It had 60% carbon dioxide. And so economically, it was kind of hard to sell this gas. And so it wasn't worth it to just separate it like usual and vent it into the atmosphere. And so they thought, hey, we'll add the enhanced oil recovery. We'll take some of that carbon dioxide. We'll sell it. They can use that to increase oil production and then makes both these things more profitable. So in 1986, when they set this up, they weren't thinking about climate change at all. But it's worth taking a minute to think, okay, does this actually have a climate benefit? It's not an easy question to answer because on the one hand, this is entirely a system that's working to produce more fossil fuels. So you're producing more natural gas from this gas field that otherwise wouldn't be economic, and you're producing more oil from the oil field that wouldn't be otherwise economic. And all of that gets burned. So in that sense, you get a lot more CO2 going out. But on the other hand, where do you draw the box? So if you didn't have this setup here, would you have the oil and gas being produced exactly the same amount elsewhere, but maybe just venting the carbon dioxide? How does this have its incremental effect on prices, whether you produce it or not? So it's not exactly an easy question. I'll leave it there for now. So you do this, what ends up happening? So this is kind of the lifetime success of this particular carbon capture facility. So you see the gray half of the circle over there on the left. And so that was all carbon that got captured and sold and used for enhanced oil recovery. And it's a lot, actually, not a lot globally, but it's a big part of all that's ever happened. A few years ago, at the time when this graph was made, Exxon claimed that 40% of the carbon dioxide that had ever been captured in the world had been captured by them at this facility. Now, if you look at the blue half, you see, okay, a lot of the carbon dioxide is being separated and still just being vented into the atmosphere. So about half of that blue slice was vented and always was intended to be vented. That's just how they designed the system. And about half of it was carbon dioxide that they'd hoped to sell, but it didn't end up being economic to sell. The oil companies didn't want to buy it. The price didn't work out. And so that is, a key thread here that you'll see come up a number of other times. So this graph shows you in blue is the oil price in that area, and the orange bars are the carbon dioxide they sold. So when they came up with the idea of this facility, late 70s, early 80s, oil prices were really high. This was going to be great. Then the oil prices dropped. And so it was operating way under its capacity for most of that time because it wasn't economic to sell it. The oil companies, it wasn't worth it to them. And so you see, early 2000s, once the price of oil started going up, they started actually capturing and selling more of the carbon dioxide. And then you see on the very right-hand side of the graph that oil prices started going down again, but they still were, capturing more carbon dioxide and selling it more than you'd expect. And that's because you have something else coming in here that affects the economics, which is tax credits. So the first tax credits were in 2008, and then again in 2018, and then in 2022. So this kind of shows that across time. The big spike at the end there is the tax credits that were part of the Inflation Reduction Act. And you can see that since they got started, there's been a level of tax credits for carbon sequestration, that's carbon capture that's used for enhanced oil recovery, which is what we've been talking about. And then a higher amount if you just stick the carbon dioxide in the ground and don't do anything, with it. And you can kind of, see why somebody would do this. It's, we already know how to strip out carbon dioxide from other gases, at least in some cases. If you can make money doing it, companies will sometimes do that. They clearly did before there were tax credits in this one case and a couple others. And so people start thinking of this as, okay, if we can make the economics of this work out, we can make this a business, and then we can kind of have our cake and eat it too. There's all this existing fossil fuel infrastructure, and it's emitting a ton of carbon dioxide. And if we're worried about climate change, what do we do about that? There's all benefits to being able to use this. It's already there. Fossil fuels are energy dense. They're easy to transport. You can use them when you need them. And so this was started to be seen as a potential climate solution, not just for natural gas processing, where it already existed, but for other sectors too, including things like power generation. So this graph is a little confusing. You look at basically the blue things exist and the gray things don't exist. So you can look at that light blue that's kind of going across the entire bottom of the graph, and those are gas processing facilities, like I was talking about at Chute Creek. These are facilities that are making natural gas, and the natural gas has carbon dioxide in it, and they need to get the carbon dioxide out in order to use the gas, and they're nearby a place where they can inject that for enhanced oil recovery. But the gray bars are what people start proposing. And so you can see there, way back before 2010, there's start to be proposed a whole lot of carbon capture capacity in power plants. And all those dark gray bars all along the top are proposed carbon capture facilities in power plants that don't exist. Then if you look at that other red circle, that very tiny little dark blue bar, that's carbon capture facilities on power plants that actually exist, that actually got built. And so clearly people have been proposing a whole lot of stuff that isn't actually happening. And so this graph ends in 2020, but if you look today, it's pretty much the same thing. So I told you earlier about those four carbon capture facilities on power plants that exist. Their capacity is around 3 on this graph. And still, if you look at what's proposed, theoretically in the next few years, we'll have, maybe 30, 60 new power plants with carbon capture on them that, can capture 100 million tons of carbon dioxide. So this pattern of great expectations and small success has been going on for decades. So kind
Can
of
I jump
what's
in and
happening
ask
here?
you a quick question?
Yes, for sure.
Great. So one of the questions is from Frank, and he asks if that chart is millions of ton of CO2 captured per year, or what's kind of if could you go
I
into
think that's per year. I can look back at the scientific paper where it was originally.
great.
So yeah, that because otherwise it would be going up and up. You see, like you can know that by looking at the gas processing, those light blue bars that were along the end, because the gas processing, it would go up much faster if you were adding the gas processing every other year. So this is the what annually it was, what should be for each year, not cumulative.
Great. And then another one is, where is the Chute Creek facility located?
Wyoming.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, my background was actually like Google Maps view of that. It's also called Labarge, like that's the name of the plant, and Chute Creek is the treatment. I don't know. You could find it either way. Um, so now I'm going to kind of tell you the story of the two. Sorry, went too far. The two carbon capture power plants that exist. So if you remember from the very beginning, I showed you that there were 4 power plants that had ever been built with carbon capture in the entire world. And two of those are fairly recent and in China, and we have no information about them. I'm going to tell you about the other two. So one of them is Petronova in Texas. Um, this is the West Parish coal plant, and the Petronova facility was designed to capture um, some carbon dioxide from like one of those four big smokestacks there, like kind of one part of the plant. And it was built in 2017. And so what they aimed to get was they aimed to capture about a third of the carbon dioxide from the portion of the facility that they were targeting. And they managed to reach about 27%. So they weren't as successful as they wanted to be, but they weren't doing that badly. But they were only ever aiming to get a very, very, very small portion of the carbon dioxide that's coming out of this coal plant in the first place. And so if you look at the actual emissions here, when the coal plant is running without the carbon capture and utilization, so this is enhanced oil recovery, that's why it's not an S there, you get about 940 metric tons of carbon dioxide per gigawatt hour of power. And it was running with this carbon capture turned on. You got about 920 metric tons of CO2 per gigawatt hour, which is fairly different. And both are numbers that are very much in the range of what a coal plant does. A lot more than a gas plant, um, and well within that range. And so that's, that's not necessarily a just total failure. They never aim to get very much. But when this plant gets pointed out as something that has a 90% carbon capture success rate, this is what they're actually talking about. But I think actually a more critical part here is the graph that I've got shown below. So this is, the y-axis here is in energy use. And this is energy use specifically for the carbon capture piece. And so you remember I said before, carbon capture involves basically, it involves heating up the thing that the carbon dioxide is bound to regenerate it. So you get the chemical back and you can bind it to more carbon dioxide. So that's a pretty energy intensive process. And in general, you're putting more coal into the plant and using more energy because you need some more energy to make this happen. And that means that it's an expense and you're only going to do it if it's worth it. So you can see here that the plant got built in 2017, and then the blue line wiggles along for a while. They're using this carbon capture, and then COVID happens. Oil prices drop, and they turn it off. So you can see there's more than a year there where it just flatlines at zero. They don't have the carbon capture facility turned on at all, which is because the oil prices are too low. Even with the tax credits that got put in 2008 and 2018, at that point, they weren't enough to make up for the low oil prices. And they were, company running this plant was better off running it with the carbon capture turned off. And then you can see a couple years later, they turn it on again. So this is the other example. Again, another coal plant. This is the Boundary Dam coal plant in Canada. And they put in this carbon capture facility in 2014. So the actual power plant in both cases is older. They were putting these on existing power plants. And so that dashed black line at the top is the amount of carbon dioxide they were initially aiming to capture from their plant, which was 90%. And then the actual amount that they did capture over the years was about 57%. And you can see it varied year to year how well this was working. And if you look at what actually happened, there were a few things going on here. One is that the carbon capture, facility, that chunk of the plant, was only working 80% of the time that the plant was working. So 20% of the time, it wasn't doing anything at all, and so all those emissions were just going out. And then, even when it was working, only about 3/4 of the gas, coming out of the plant even went through that. So a significant amount was just never went through the carbon capture facility in the first place. And so, what were the results of these plants? So I already showed you Petronova still produces 920 metric tons of carbon dioxide per gigawatt hour when its carbon capture facility is turned on, pretty much just a coal plant. Now, Boundary Dam, they did better. So when they've got their system running, they get down to about 350 metric tons of carbon dioxide per gigawatt hour. So that is better than a gas plant. You've put a kind of generic rail belt gas plant on there for comparison. That's about 450. But, it's not 90% better than a gas plant. It's just somewhat better. So that's kind of really our entire data set on carbon capture and power generation. And if you remember that graph I showed you earlier that had that huge amount of dark gray power plants with carbon capture that were supposedly going to get built, well, what happened? In a lot of cases, they just never got built, or they started and then something went wrong. One big example was Mississippi's Kemper project. They were trying to actually do a gas plant there. The cost ballooned more than doubled, and the system failed. And then they just demolished the carbon capture part of the plant in 2021. And so there's a lot more of these stories than there are the stories of Petronova and Boundary Dam.
So there's another question in the chat, which is there a study on the reasons for failure or cost increases for these projects?
I don't know of one that's like just directly that does all of that. There's a lot of things on these individual ones, but I'll kind of talk in a minute here about some of the general cost issues. So going back to kind of basically what this carbon dioxide capture technology we're using here is, you cool the gas coming out of the smokestack before you can send it through this carbon capture chemical. So that takes some energy off the bat. And then you're running the gas mixture through a chemical that binds to the carbon dioxide. Then you're heating that up again to release the carbon dioxide, regenerate your chemical. And then you've got to do something with the carbon dioxide you ended up with. So how, where do the issues come in with doing this? One issue is how much carbon dioxide is in your gas stream in the first place. So when I was talking about Chute Creek, they had 60% carbon dioxide in the gas they had coming out of the ground. And in some of these other natural gas processing plants, they might have 30%. Sometimes it's less, but it can be quite high. And unsurprisingly, the more carbon dioxide you have in your initial gas, the easier it is to get it out. The less energy and the less cost you have to put in to get a ton of carbon dioxide out. This is why on the other end of the spectrum, capturing carbon dioxide directly from the air is amazingly difficult and energy intensive because it's such a small portion of the air. And so that also, leads to differences in the different power plants too. So coal power plants have around 13% carbon dioxide in their exhaust, while natural gas plants have only 3%. And so, because you might wonder, well, why are we talking about building new coal plants to capture their carbon dioxide instead of just capturing it from the gas plants we already have that are in some cases sitting almost on top of the depleted oil fields they want to put carbon dioxide in? And that's pretty much the reason, is that it's a lot harder because natural gas power plant exhaust has a lot less carbon dioxide in it, and the natural gas is expensive. So why does it matter that the natural gas is expensive? Well, all of this stuff takes energy, right? Cooling the gas takes energy. Heating up the bound chemical to regenerate it takes a lot of energy. So, for example, the Terra Flatlands proposal estimates a quarter of the energy that this coal plant would be using is for carbon capture. So only 3/4 of it actually it's going to go out the power line to everybody else. And so it's got to burn a whole lot of extra fuel to produce the same amount of energy versus a plant that didn't have carbon capture. And that fuel, costs the same amount for doing that as it does for making the power in the first place. So if you take expensive fuel, like our expensive natural gas, and you try to, burn a quarter more than you need, and even more than that, because natural gas power plant exhaust doesn't have much CO2, you're going to quickly get to something that's very, very expensive. And so another thing is that carbon dioxide is corrosive and difficult to deal with. I mean, this is why in the 1930s they needed to figure out how to get it out of the natural gas. If a carbon dioxide pipeline leaks, the resulting gas will pool and it can cause suffocation. It can, cars won't start. This isn't, this is a problem that's not impossible to deal with. Carbon dioxide pipelines do exist, but it's more technically difficult and has more risk of failure than having a pipeline that just has, say, natural gas in it. And finally, and more importantly, nobody wants the carbon dioxide. I mean, this is pretty much just a waste product that people don't want. I mean, there is carbon dioxide used in industry. It's a very small amount compared to global emissions from any of these sectors. And you can kind of see from the story of natural gas processing and enhanced oil recovery that it takes some pretty unique situations to make it make economic sense to do something with the carbon dioxide that you've separated out other than just venting it into the atmosphere. And so I think, and one of the things here is that fundamentally, economically, the idea of sequestering carbon as a business doesn't make sense. We've been trying to pretend pollution regulation into a business through tax credits and wishful thinking. Now, I'm not saying that you can't subsidize a clean energy technology as a valid mechanism to get this to a place where it can be usable. I mean, all renewable energy technology has been there. It's been subsidized. in order to get going and to make it more competitive with other forms of energy. However, all those subsidies are going towards producing something we actually need, energy. Like the thing you're getting out of that is something you actually want. And so if something happened to the subsidies, if they aren't going on for some reason, you don't go and like smash all the solar panels. I mean, you might not invest in new solar panels, but the existing solar panels, they're still producing energy. They're not, you know, suddenly going to become more polluting because you turn the subsidy off. But relying on tax credits to turn carbon capture and sequestration into a business, it's a little bit more like you're paying a factory for each pound of mercury it doesn't dump in a river. So if you weren't going to dump any mercury in the river in the first place, well, you can't get any of that money. So you don't have any mercury to turn in. And if you stop paying the factory to dump to collect its mercury and give it to you, or the cost of collecting the mercury goes up, then they just go right back to dumping it in the river. And so it's always cheaper not to run a carbon capture facility. It's a huge parasitic load on a power plant. You can see this in the history of Petronova. It's a tiny piece of their power plant, but still, you know, when the tax combination of 2020 era tax credits and the amount they were getting paid for oil recovery wasn't enough, they just turned the carbon capture piece off and you're left with the existing fossil fuel plant. And so how does this relate to the proposal out in the West Sioux? Well, for one, in their reports, they plan for a 90% carbon capture success rate that we haven't seen. We haven't tried that many times, and most things never even got to the constructed phase, and the few that did never got close to sequestering 90% of the carbon from an entire power plant. And this assumes that, the costs of this are largely a lot of the infrastructure getting paid for by someone else, the West Susitna Road, by the state, the power lines by whoever's buying the power, and the beating rail belt consumers. And also, they've applied, I think, for a federal grant. And so, those tax credits, theoretically, the tax credits in the Inflation Reduction Act are going to be available for 12 years. And they say, okay, we think actually they'll get extended and be available indefinitely. Now, I don't know about all of you, but I think I'm pretty uncertain what tax credits will exist, say, next week. And I think anybody who claims they're certain about what tax credits will exist next week or next month, much less in 12 years, can't know that. And that's pretty key because, as I was saying, the model of sequestering this carbon only works if someone's paying for it. It's not really a business of itself. And so, what if this doesn't work out perfectly? Well, you end up with something that we kind of have already in our Healy clean coal plant, which was an overly expensive, dirty coal plant. It was heavily subsidized. It was built on the promise of experimental technology, and we are still stuck with it today. And so this is a graph that I put in a post I made on my Alaskan Energy blog, kind of going through the economics of the Flatlands proposal. And I won't go into all the details of that here today. You can go read them there. But I do want to highlight over on the right-hand side this big sort of downward facing red arrow. That's the part of the economics of the plant that's reliant on the carbon capture working, sequestering 90% of the carbon, and getting the um, high levels of tax credits in the Inflation Reduction Act. So all of that is really kind of key here to that um, analysis of how they think the economics are going to work out. And I think that, as I've hopefully demonstrated, there's a lot of reasons to be suspicious of that. And so you can see just right next to that, I went through and kind of applied what I think of as more reasonable assumptions. Again, you can see the details in the blog post for how much it might actually cost if you include things like roads and transmission and less optimism about carbon capture, which is more expensive than even the imported LNG we're probably going to end up with pretty shortly. And right about in line with that Healy 2. So the Healy clean coal plant that I mentioned earlier, that's this Healy 2 coal plant and manages to produce power for quite a lot more than the original Healy 1 old school non-experimental coal plant. And both are still being used today. And with that, I want to thank everyone, and I'd be happy to take questions if anyone has any.
Yeah, thank you so much, Erin. That is a dense presentation and a lot to take in. Thank you for putting so much information together. If y'all have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. Um, and while we're kind of waiting for folks to put in some questions, I have some other questions about are there any safety considerations beyond? Oh, Dewey Bittlers asks if Healy 2 was shut down. Do you know?
It No, it's still going today. It has had a long and sordid history where it was shut down for a long time. It was restarted. Golden Valley was supposedly going to shut it down by this year, but didn't because they couldn't get enough gas power from southern utilities. And since, given its expensive lack of reliability and the high level of emissions, they would like to shut it down and probably will as soon as they can.
Are there any other proposed coal projects and or carbon sequestration projects in the state right now?
Um, Not that I know of. There's very few new coal power plants being built anywhere in the country. I think the UAF plant that's combined heat and power. Can't remember exactly what year that was, but a number of years ago was the first one in a very long time. And that's actually an issue in kind of figuring out economics is that you can't really, we don't have a great big set of data to go on for what the capital costs of something like this really are, even in either in the coal plant itself or in the carbon capture. And as you might expect, people are often optimistic about that kind of thing.
Is there any chance that we could get you to turn off your screen share, Erin?
Oh, yes, you could. Sorry about that.
Awesome. Oh, no worries. It's always easy to forget that one thing. Laura Wright has a question that says this might be no, it's not a dumb question, but how are you selling the CO2? Do you pipe it somewhere or how does that piece work? How
So it's not a dumb question. Let me just, can you stop my screen sharing? I cannot figure this out for
Let
some
me
reason.
see. I will try it while you are
Oh no,
answering.
I think I see it. I just put it
Okay.
off on the side. Okay.
Cool.
So in this case, I'm sorry, it got all dark around me. Anyway, I wasn't even noticing. I could turn on the light, but in this case, you're basically not selling the CO2. And listen to this proposal. So when you're selling the CO2, which just happens in a lot of these cases, you're selling it to a company producing oil that wants to pump it into the ground to get more oil out of the reservoir because it increases the pressure in the reservoir and more oil comes out. So that's the only selling generally that's going on. There's some cases where you might be selling a small amount for industrial purposes, like carbonating beverages and such, but that's tiny compared to enhanced oil recovery. The idea for, at least so far, for the Flatlands proposal is that they aren't selling it at all. They're just relying on tax credits to provide the money to cover the cost of capturing it, transporting it, sequestering it in Cook Inlet, and some extra to make profit on top of that to drive the costs of their project down.
Great, thank you. Then there's another question. Uh, she had a follow-up question is, so sequestration is putting the CO2 back into the ground?
Yes, that's the idea. And so there's carbon capture, utilization, and sequestration. So utilization, for the most part, is if you put it in the ground, but then you get more oil up. And sequestration is if you just put it in the ground and you're not trying to get more oil or anything coming back up.
Great. Well, I'm going to bring on another individual that had a question. So, Mark Masteller, I'm going to allow you to talk. This worked really well last time.
Yeah, good evening, Aaron. Just a quick, you mentioned that industrial CO2 markets are small. Do you know if the size of our industrial CO2 market in Anchorage, South Central has been quantified at all?
I'm not sure. I could look into that, but there is no way that anybody uses the amount of CO2 in Anchorage that would come out of any power plant, the ones we have or a new one. Like it's just not, we don't use millions of tons of CO2. I mean, we definitely don't use millions of tons of CO2 in Anchorage. I don't know exactly how big it is, but I could try to look that up.
Yeah, thanks.
Awesome. Thank you, Mark. Next, I'm going to bring on Melis, who also had a question. Let me bring her on. Melis, if you'd like to ask your question here.
Hi, thanks, Erin. Really appreciate the presentation. I've seen the Flatland, or I guess Terra Energy's presentation on the Susitna Clean Coal project. And there was discussion during the presentation about selling CO2. Another purpose they'd mentioned is maybe for agricultural purposes. So I was wondering if you knew much about that. And then the second part of that is, one of the tools being used to finance the project would be a Department of Energy grant that's funded to somebody that sequesters the CO2. So if you sell small portions of the CO2, would that negate kind of the major purpose of the grant to just sequester it, or do you know anything about those ratios?
So the it wouldn't, so if you're talking about the grant, it's whatever the grant giver says. So in general, given that the federal government has in the past allowed tax credits, but at different levels for carbon dioxide that's sequestered versus used, I expect that the same kind of thing could apply. But of course, I have no idea what the federal government's going to do. If you think you have an idea of what the federal government's going to do, I don't know. We'd all like your crystal ball. Um, but in general, like that, the agricultural, I mean, you can, Alaska projects, and you can see this for a lot of things. People often like to invent industries that they say will come into existence if something they want to build happens. So, will a whole bunch of, greenhouses spring into existence out by Flatlands coal lease to be a viable agricultural business that's going to use their waste heat and CO2 to be this amazing agricultural operation? Well, you know, I'm fairly skeptical, but it's not something you can even really address with numbers like I just did. It's, will something that doesn't exist now spring into existence if we build this?
Thank
But
you.
it's mostly the tax credits that could potentially, if things work out just as well as they would like, possibly fund this. But like I said, you can also always just turn off the carbon capture if it's not making you money.
Great. Thank you, Melis, for that question. Another question we have is the governor still pushing carbon sequestration?
Oh, probably. I mean, I think that the governor's idea is kind of sort of similar to the tax credit idea, but it's basically like, okay, there's going to be, the original idea was, I think, that there were going to be places elsewhere in the world where there were folks desperate to sequester carbon dioxide, either because they were forced to or because there were some kind of tax credit like incentives that they would want to pay Alaska for the privilege of putting it in our ground. As far as I know, there really isn't an industry to ship carbon dioxide around the world and sequester it in other places. You go back to the beginning of my presentation, there's very little sequestering of carbon dioxide that happens at all. And where you are capturing it, you're mostly using it to produce oil right there.
Okay. Got it. Well, thank you. Any last call for questions right now? It's 7:01, but I know this is a big topic, and I'm sure there are a lot of questions out there. Well, thank you so much, Erin, for taking the time to put this together. It's such an incredible presentation to dive into such a complex topic and give us an overview. So thank you very much. And I wanted to flag that Susitna River Coalition has a few things coming up around the corner. One is that MEA elections are coming up. And Mark Masteller, SRC endorsed candidate, who we heard from just a second ago, is hosting an event at 203 Kombucha on March 10th in Palmer. So if you happen to be in Palmer, please go check out that event. Beyond that, the STIP Amendment 2, the State Transportation Infrastructure Plan Amendment number 2, is currently out for comment. So Susitna River Coalition has some instructions on how to comment and a way to sign on to a letter that I will drop into the chat. That comment deadline is March 20th, so you can work on opposing the DOT portion of the West Susitna Access Road and provide your thoughts on that project. And again, the West Susitna Access Road would go out to an Australian gold mine, and that gold mine actually, or exploratory gold mine project, and they are actually partial funders in that Nova Minerals are investors in that project. And then coming up on April 17th, Howard Carbone and Corinne Marzullo will present about some of their projects out in the Peters Hills, and that will be on April 17th at the Denali Arts Hangar here in Talkeetna. And if anyone has any questions, please reach out to us. We'd love to pass them along to Erin and get you all in touch. And I'll send out a follow-up email with information regarding this presentation and ways to watch it and share. So thank you everyone for being here. And thank you so much, Erin, for taking the time to come and share your information with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you so much, everyone. Have a good night.